Chapter 22 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Victories in the West. New Western states were coming into the Union, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, and in Susan's opinion, it was highly important that they be admitted as women's suffrage states, for she had not forgotten that disturbing line of the Supreme Court decision in the Virginia minor case which read, "No new state has ever been admitted to the Union which has conferred the right of suffrage on women, and this has never been considered a valid objection to her admission." Susan wanted to start a new trend. Opposition to Wyoming's women's suffrage provision was strong in Congress, in spite of the fact that it had the unanimous approval of Wyoming's Constitutional Convention. To Susan, in the gallery of the House of Representatives, listening anxiously to the debate on the admission of Wyoming, defeat was unthinkable after women had voted in the territory of Wyoming for 20 years. But Democrats, wishing to block the admission of a preponderantly Republican state, used women's suffrage as an excuse. With a sinking heart, she heard an amendment offered, limiting suffrage in Wyoming to males. At the crucial moment, however, the tide was turned by a telegram from the Wyoming legislature, the words of which rejoiced Susan. "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without women's suffrage." After this, the House voted to admit Wyoming 139 to 127, but the Senate delayed, renewing the attack on the women's suffrage provision. Not until July 1890, while she was speaking to a large audience in the Opera House at Madison, South Dakota, did the good news of the admission of Wyoming reach her. Jubilant as she commented on this great victory, she spoke as one inspired, for she saw this as the turning point in her 40 long years of uphill work. Neither North Dakota nor South Dakota had wanted to risk their chances of statehood by incorporating women's suffrage in their constitutions. Yet public opinion in both states was friendly, South Dakota directing its first legislature to submit the question to the voters. It was this that brought Susan to South Dakota in 1890. Sentiment for women's suffrage in South Dakota had previously been created almost entirely by the WCTU, and this had linked women's suffrage and prohibition together. Now, the liquor interests made prohibition an issue in this women's suffrage campaign, as they rallied their forces for the repeal of prohibition which had been adopted when South Dakota was admitted to statehood. Through the propaganda of the liquor interests, the 30,000 foreign-born voters became formidable opponents, and newly naturalized Russians, Scandinavians, and Poles, given the vote before American women, wore badges carrying the slogan, "Against Women's Suffrage and Susan B. Anthony." Both Republicans and Democrats cultivated these foreign-born voters, turning a cold shoulder to the women's suffrage amendment and refusing to endorse it in their state conventions. Even the Farmers' Alliance and the Knights of Labor, previously friendly to women's suffrage, now joined with the prohibitionists to form a third political party which also failed to endorse the women's suffrage amendment. On top of all this, anti-suffragists from Massachusetts, calling themselves remonstrants, flooded South Dakota with their leaflets. It now seemed to Susan as if every clever politician had lined up against women. During these trying days, Anna Howard Shaw joined her, and together they covered the state, hoping by the truth and sincerity of their statements to quash the propaganda against women's suffrage. Often they traveled in freight cars, as transportation was limited, or drove long distances in wagons over the sun-baked prairie. The heat was intense, and the hot winds, blowing incessantly, seared everything they touched. After 2 years of drought, the farmers were desperately poor, and Susan, concerned over their plight, wondered why Congress could not have appropriated the money for artesian wells to help these honest, earnest people, instead of voting $40,000 for an investigating commission. Occasionally, Susan and Anna spent the night in isolated sod houses where ingenious pioneer women cooked their scant meals over burning chips of buffalo bones gathered on the prairie. Glorying in the valiant spirit of these women, who in loneliness and hardship played an important but unheralded role in the conquest of this new country, Susan was generous with her praise. To them, her words of commendation were like a benediction, and few of them ever forgot a visit from Susan B. Anthony. By this time, life on the frontier was an old story to her, for she had campaigned under similar conditions in Kansas and in the far West. Nonetheless, the hardships were trying. Yet this plucky woman of 70 wrote friends in the East, "Tell everybody that I am perfectly well in body and in mind, never better, and never doing more work. Oh, the lack of modern comforts and conveniences! But I can put up with it better than any of the young folks. I shall push ahead and do my level best to carry this state, come weal or woe to me personally. I never felt so buoyed up with the love and sympathy and confidence of the good people everywhere." Young, vigorous Anna Howard Shaw proved to be a campaigner after Susan's own heart, tireless, uncomplaining, and good-tempered, an exceptional speaker, witty and quick to say the right word at the right time. It was a joy to find in Anna the same devotion to the cause that she herself felt, the same crusading fervor and reliability. During the long drives over the prairie, she talked to Anna of the work that must be done, of what it would mean to the woman of the future, and she fired Anna's soul with the flame that burned in her own. Another young Western woman, Carrie Chapman Catt, also attracted Susan's attention at this time. She had volunteered for the South Dakota campaign after attending her first National Women's Suffrage Convention, and Susan, meeting her in Huron, South Dakota, to map out a speaking tour for her, found a tall, handsome, confident young woman ready to attack the work and see it through, in spite of the hardships which confronted her. Carrie Lane, a graduate of Iowa State College, had briefly studied law and taught school before her marriage to Lee Chapman. Now, 4 years after his death, she had married George W. Catt of Seattle, a promising young engineer and a former fellow student at Iowa State College. What particularly impressed Susan was that Carrie, in spite of her marriage in June, had kept her pledge to come to South Dakota. She was pleased with the way Carrie not only heroically filled every difficult engagement, but sized up the campaign for herself and planned for the future. In Carrie's report of her work, there was a ruthless practicality which was rare, and which instantly won Susan's approval. Here was a young woman to watch and to keep in the work. The visible result of 6 months of campaigning was defeat, with the vote 22,972 for women's suffrage and 45,632 opposed. And as Susan remembered the maneuvers of the politicians, the trading of votes for the location of the state capital, and the scheming of the liquor interests, she felt she was championing a lonely cause. From now on, Susan hoped to turn over to the younger women much of the lecturing and organizing in the West, and she needed an anchorage, a home of her own from which she could direct her work. Her mother had willed 17 Madison Street to Mary, who had rented the first floor and was living on the second, where there was a room for Susan. Now that Susan planned to spend more time at home, and Mary had retired from teaching, they decided to take over the whole house, modernize and redecorate it, and enjoy it the rest of their lives. Mary, as usual, took charge, but Susan had definite ideas about what should be done. Mary, who had learned to be cautious and frugal, was more willing than Susan to make old furnishings do, but their friends came to the rescue, showering them with gifts. Freshly painted and papered, with new rugs on the floor, lace curtains at the windows, easy chairs and new furniture here and there, the house was all Susan had wished for, and everywhere were familiar touches, such as her mother's spinning wheel by the fireplace in the back parlor. She spent most of her time in her study on the second floor. Here she hung her pictures of the reformers she admired and loved, and right over her desk, looking down at her, was the comforting picture of her dearest friend, Mrs. Stanton. Hour after hour she sat at this desk, writing letters, hurriedly dashing off one after another, writing just as the thoughts came, as if she were talking, bothering little with punctuation, using dashes instead, and vigorously underlining words and phrases for emphasis. Instructions to workers in all parts of the country, letters of friendship and sympathy, answers to the many questions which came in every mail, these were signed and sealed, one after another, and slipped into the mailbox when she took a brisk walk before going to bed. She started each day with the morning newspaper, stepping out on the front veranda to pick it up, taking a deep breath of fresh air, and enjoying the green grass and the tall, graceful chestnut trees in front of the house. Then sitting down in the back parlor, beside the big table covered with magazines and mail, she carefully read her paper before beginning the work at her desk, for she must keep up to date on the news. Rochester was important to her. It was her city, and she was on hand with her colleagues whenever there was an opportunity for women to express interest in its government, progress, or welfare. Not only did she encourage women to make use of their newly won right to vote in school elections, she also urged municipal suffrage for women, appealing to the governor to appoint a woman to fill a vacancy on the Board of Trustees of Rochester's State Industrial School. She herself received the appointment, which the Democrat and Chronicle called a fitting recognition of one of the ablest and best women in the Commonwealth. One of her first acts as trustee was a practical one for the girls. Spent entire day at State Industrial School, she wrote in her diary, getting the laundry girls, who had always washed for the entire institution by hand and ironed that old way, transferred to the boys' laundry room to use its machinery. I'm sure it will work well. Girls, 12 of them, delighted. She also taught the boys to patch and darn, and later asked for coeducation. Susan looked forward to welcoming Mrs. Stanton at 17 Madison Street when she returned to this country in 1891, particularly because she had sold her home in Tenafly after her husband's death in 1887, and now had no home to go to. Susan hoped that as they again worked together, she could persuade Mrs. Stanton to concentrate on more serious writing than the chatty reminiscences she had just published, and which Susan felt were not the greatest of herself. When she heard that Mrs. Stanton seriously contemplated living in New York with 2 of her children, she begged her to reconsider, writing, "This is the first time since 1850 that I have anchored myself to any particular spot, and in doing it my constant thought was that you would come here, and stay for as long, at least, as we must be together to put your writings into systematic shape to go down to posterity. I have no writings to go down, so my ambition is not for myself, but is for the one by the side of whom I have wrought these 40 years, and to get whose speeches before audiences has been the delight of my life." Mrs. Stanton decided to make her home in New York, but first she visited Susan, who found her as stimulating as ever and brimful of ideas. They plotted and planned as of old, and managed to stir up public opinion on the question of admitting women to the University of Rochester. With women enrolled at the University of Michigan since 1870, and at Cornell since 1872, and with Columbia University yielding at last to women's entreaties by establishing Barnard College in 1889, they felt it their duty to awaken Rochester, and although their agitation produced no immediate results, it did start other women thinking, and made news for the press. The cartoons on the subject delighted them both. Susan soon realized that the writing she had planned for Mrs. Stanton would never be done, for Mrs. Stanton had already made up her mind to write for magazines and newspapers on new and controversial subjects, feeling this was the best contribution she could make to the cause. Susan also found it increasingly difficult to hold her old friend to the straight path of women's suffrage, Mrs. Stanton insisting that too much concentration on this one subject was narrowing and left women unprepared for the intelligent use of the ballot. Women, Mrs. Stanton argued, needed to be stirred up to think, and this they would not do as long as their minds were dominated by the Church, which she believed had for generations hampered their development by emphasizing their inferiority and subordination. She was determined to analyze and rebel, and Susan could in no way divert her. Completely absorbed in trying to prove that the Bible, accurately translated and interpreted, did not teach the inferiority or the subordination of women, she was writing a book which she called the Woman's Bible, chapters of which were already appearing in the Woman's Tribune. Susan was not unsympathetic to Mrs. Stanton's ideas, but she opposed this excursion into religious controversy because she was sure it would stir up futile wrangles among the suffragists and keep Mrs. Stanton from giving her best to the cause. Her lack of interest then, and her frank disapproval as the Woman's Bible progressed, were a great disappointment to Mrs. Stanton, and these 2 old friends began to grow somewhat apart as they took different roads to reach their goal, the one intent on freeing women's minds, the other determined to establish their citizenship. Yet their friendship endured. In 1892, Susan reluctantly consented to Mrs. Stanton's retirement as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Mrs. Stanton's request that she be followed by Susan won unanimous approval, and Anna Howard Shaw was moved up to second place, vice president at large. For 40 years, Susan had watched Mrs. Stanton preside with a poise, warmth, and skill which few could equal. She knew she would miss her dynamic, reassuring presence at the conventions. Yet she was obliged to admit to herself that it was more than fitting that she should at last head the ever-growing organization which she had built up. This was the last convention which Mrs. Stanton attended, and it was the last for Lucy Stone, who died the next year. Susan appreciated the eager young women who now took their places, but she did not yet feel completely at home with them. "Only think," she wrote an old-time colleague, "I shall not have a white-haired woman on the platform with me, and I shall be alone there of all the pioneer workers. Always with the old guard, I had perfect confidence that the wise and right thing would be said. What a platform ours then was of self-reliant, strong women! I felt sure of you all. I cannot feel quite certain that our younger sisters will be equal to the emergency. Yet they are each and all valiant, earnest, and talented, and will soon be left to manage the ship without even me." In 1892, the year of the presidential election, Susan hopefully attended the national political conventions. Again the Republicans made their proverbial excuses, explaining that they not only faced a formidable opponent in Grover Cleveland, but also the threat of a new People's Party. The familiar ring of their alibis, which they had repeated since Reconstruction days, made Susan wonder when, and if ever, the Republicans would feel able to bear the strain of women's suffrage. Their platform remembered the poor, the foreign-born, and male Negroes, but it still ignored women. Yet hope for the future stirred in her heart, as she saw at the convention 2 women serving as delegates from Wyoming. Here was the entering wedge. The Democrats, as usual, were silent on women's suffrage, but undismayed by them, or by the prohibitionists, who this year failed to endorse votes for women, Susan moved on to Omaha with Anna Howard Shaw for the first national convention of the new People's Party. Here she met representatives of the Farmers' Alliance and the Knights of Labor, both friendly to women's suffrage, and men from other groups critical of the 2 major political parties for their failure to solve the pressing economic problems confronting the nation. Susan was sympathetic with many of the aims of the People's Party, having seen with her own eyes the plight of debt-burdened, hard-working farmers, and having crusaded in her own paper the Revolution for the rights of labor and for the control of industrial monopoly. However, she still viewed minor reform parties with a highly critical eye. The People's Party gave her no women's suffrage plank, and she found them quite as obvious to the underlying principle of justice to women as either of the old parties. With the election of Grover Cleveland, whose opposition to women's suffrage was well known, and with the Democrats in the saddle for another 4 years, congressional action on the women's suffrage amendment was blocked. Nevertheless, the cause moved ahead in the states. Colorado was to vote on the question in 1893, and Kansas in 1894, and New York was revising its constitution. In addition, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 offered endless opportunities to bring the subject before the people. As soon as plans for the World's Fair were underway, Susan began to work indirectly through prominent women in Washington and Chicago for the appointment of women to the Board of Management. Lady managers were appointed, 115 strong, who proved to be very much alive under the leadership of Mrs. Bertha Honoré Palmer. Susan found Mrs. Palmer almost as determined as she to secure equality of rights for women at the World's Fair, and nothing that she herself might have planned could have been more effective than the series of world congresses in which both men and women took part, or than the World's Congress of Representative Women. 2 of Susan's girls, as she liked to call them, Rachel Foster Avery and May Wright Sewell, were appointed by Mrs. Palmer to take charge of the World's Congress of Representative Women, and they arranged a meeting of the International Council of Women as a part of this Congress. Convening soon after the opening of the World's Fair, the Congress of Representative Women drew record crowds at its 81 sessions. 27 countries and 126 organizations were represented. Here Susan, to her joy, heard Negroes, American Indians, and Mormons tell of their progress and their problems, and saw them treated with as much respect as American millionaires, English nobility, or the most virtuous conservative housewife. Watching these women assemble, talking with them, and listening to their well-delivered speeches, she felt richly rewarded for the lonely work she had undertaken 40 years before, when scarcely a woman could be coaxed to a meeting, or be persuaded to express her opinions in public. Although only one session of the Congress was devoted to the civil and political rights of women, it was gratifying to her that women's need of the ballot was spontaneously brought up in meeting after meeting, showing that women, whatever their cause or whatever their organization, were recognizing that only by means of the vote could their reforms be achieved. Speaking on the subject to which she had dedicated her life, Susan gave credit to the pioneering suffragists for the change which had taken place in public opinion regarding the position of women. She urged women's organizations to give suffrage their wholehearted support, and pointed out the great power of some of the newer organizations, such as the WCTU, with its membership of 500,000, and the Young General Federation of Women's Clubs of 40,000 members. Confessing that her own National American Women's Suffrage Association in comparison was poor in numbers and limited in funds, she added, "I would philosophize on the reason why. It is because women have been taught always to work for something else than their own personal freedom. And the hardest thing in the world is to organize women for the one purpose of securing their political liberty and political equality." Even so, the vital women's rights organizations, she concluded, drew the whole world to them in spirit, if not in person. Her very presence among them, without her words, in fact her very presence on the fairgrounds, advertised her cause, for in the mind of the public she personified women's suffrage. This tall, dignified woman with smooth gray hair, abundant in energy and spontaneous friendliness, was the center of attraction at the World's Congress of Representative Women. In her new black dress of Chinese silk, brightened with blue, and her small black bonnet, trimmed with lace and blue forget-me-nots, she was the perfect picture of everyone's grandmother, and the people took her to their hearts. She was the one woman all wanted to see. Curious crowds jammed the hall and corridors when she was scheduled to speak, and often a policeman had to clear the way for her. At whatever meeting she appeared, the audience at once burst into applause and started calling for her, interrupting the speakers, and were not satisfied until she had mounted the platform so that all could see her and she had said a few words. Then they cheered her. After years of ridicule and unpopularity, she hardly knew what to make of all this, but she accepted it with happiness as a tribute to her beloved cause. Many who had been critical and wary of her new-fangled notions began to reverse their opinions after they saw her and heard her words of good common sense. Even those who still opposed women's suffrage left the World's Fair with a new respect for Susan B. Anthony. She stayed on in Chicago for much of the summer and fall, for she was in demand as a speaker at several of the World Congresses, and had 5 speeches to read for Mrs. Stanton, who felt unable to brave the heat and the crowds. She felt at home in this bustling, rapidly growing city, which for so many years had been the halfway station on her lecture and campaign trips through the West. Here she had always found a warm welcome, first from her cousins, the Dickinsons, then from the ever-widening circle of friends she won for her cause. Now she was literally swamped with hospitality. She rejoiced that such great numbers of everyday people were able to enjoy the beauty of the fairgrounds and the many interesting exhibits. And when a group of clergymen urged Sunday closing, she took issue with them, declaring that Sunday was the only day on which many were free to attend. Asked by a disapproving clergyman if she would like to have a son of hers attend Buffalo Bill's Wild West show on Sunday, she promptly and bluntly replied, "Of course I would, and I think he would learn far more there than from the sermons in some churches." Hearing of this, Buffalo Bill offered her a box at his popular Wild West show, and she appeared the next day with 12 of her girls. Dashing into the arena on his spirited horse, while the band played and the spotlight flashed on him, Buffalo Bill rode directly up to Susan's box, reined his horse, and swept off his big Western hat to salute her. Quick to respond, she rose and bowed, and beaming with pleasure, waved her handkerchief at him, while the immense audience applauded and cheered. She returned home early in November 1893, with happy memories of the World's Fair and to good news from Colorado. "Telegram from Denver. Said women's suffrage carried by 5,000 majority," she recorded in her diary. This laconic comment in no way expressed the joy in her heart. Her diaries, written hurriedly in small fine script, year after year, in black-covered notebooks about 3 inches by 6, were a brief, terse record of her work and her travels. Only occasionally a line of philosophizing shone out from the mass of routine detail, or an illuminating comment on a friend or a difficult situation, but she never failed to record a family anniversary, a birthday, or a death. The Colorado victory, referred to so casually in her diary, was actually of great importance to her and her cause, for it carried forward the trend initiated by the admission of Wyoming as a woman's suffrage state in 1890. Colorado also proved to her that her girls could take over her work. So busy had she been winning goodwill for the cause at the World's Fair that she had left Colorado in the capable hands of the women of the state and of young, efficient Carrie Chapman Catt, to whom she now turned over the supervision of all state campaigns. Encouragement also came from another part of the world, from New Zealand, where the vote was extended to women. This confirmed her growing conviction that equal citizenship was best understood on the frontier, and that in her own country victory would come from the West. End of chapter 22.